Good morning to all of you. I hope you had a wonderful weekend with some good reflections there from Friday afternoon sessions. And when I go through these names, of course, I also greet and welcome our partners, our BEAF partners, our Association World partners. And they are really the ones helping to enable that we can offer this for complementary for associations. So thank you to all of you so much. And it's a learning process for all of us, not only for the associations, but I think our partners are also generally interested in understanding what is going on, what do associations do, how do they plan. And besides, many of your convention bureaus are also, of course, associations and have that sort of structure. So you might go through similar experiences and challenges and discussing the same issues internally that we discuss as association, of course, as well. Just briefly, maybe some takeaways from Friday. I mean, I was personally quite motivated. I have to say that there was such a big engagement. We got feedback. The breakout sessions worked quite well. I have to thank Miguel for managing the breakout sessions. I mean, that is an art on its own to do that. It's not the easiest endeavor. So if people are not necessarily in the group they wish to be, then please let us know, let Miguel and me know, and you can be reallocated, of course. But I mean, I think what was not too much of a surprise is that people are very interested in learning. Maybe what came to a surprise on Friday was just, let's say, the speed of how we learn so much in a short period of time. And I think also maybe the underlining mentioning here and there that we also need to be careful that we as association leaders actually take our teams with us, that we don't leave anybody behind in what we actually do, because I think there is an issue of well-being to be a bit more focused on. I think it's okay sometimes to say I'm not okay or we are not okay. So I think it was also a bit of the underlined mentioning there here and there that well-being becomes more of an issue and that we need to take care a bit more of each other. And I think that is very much the case, and we cannot forget about that, and probably should do a special session on the well-being element. But hopefully Friday also inspired you a little bit, made you wonder, made you question yourself, but also acknowledged maybe where and what and where we do well and where we maybe need a bit more support, maybe sometimes more support than we wish to receive. So in any case, I think the topic this morning, of course, two topics this morning is advocacy campaigning. And then hybrid events, one topic that also keeps us very busy in mind. And I guess whether that is an association or as an organizer or supplier convention bureau, I think that is one of the big topics that keeps us busy. And the first session starting this morning is related to advocacy and campaigning. And Miguel has prepared a Slido for that. Just to find out where we are as associations in terms of our general efforts related to advocacy and campaigning.
What we're asking here is, how would you rate your association's success in advocating for its cause? So generally in advocating, how would you rate your association or the body that you represent success in advocating for itself? So use the link in the chat or scan the QR code with a mobile device. You can also go to slido.com and enter BEAF in all caps, and you'll have access to the poll. And we'll switch to a second question in a second, but the link will stay the same. So we can see we have 23 people participating at the moment. Average score of 5.9. This is a 1 to 10 scale, so pretty interesting. Kai, I don't know if that's roughly what you were expecting, or is it higher or lower?
It's Not what I was expecting. I thought the rate would be higher, to be honest, but I think it clearly shows maybe a difference between the industry-funded associations and non-industry-funded associations, because the industry-funded associations seem to have done a lot more advocacy campaigning, whether it's around Horizon, the EU Green Deal or so. So I thought we would see more. We would see that score slightly higher. But it then possibly means that the non-industry funded associations are staying a bit behind, just because of maybe technology, the efforts, just trying to get their heads around. Many of them are volunteer-driven associations. So, yes, interesting.
I think also interesting to see there's no 9s or 10s and only 2 8s. So it's definitely room to improve in this area.
Yes.
Shall we move on to the next poll?
Please, yes.
Okay. And the next poll says, it's a similar question, but slightly different. How well is your association positioned to reach the right EU legislators and influencers? So it's all about, are you reaching the right people or potentially the right people that might be able to help you the most? There we go. And we can see already quite a few people. Yes. 14 entries so far. Really, really varied scores here. We have everything other than a 7 already selected. So, but it looks like the score is around the middle. The 5.0 is really where we are.
Yes, that is not so surprising to me personally now, because in many of the discussions that we have with associations, they all mention that at the moment they have a lot of contact with civil servants, but they get less to the MEPs directly, whether before they made their in-person meeting through their office for their 20-minute pitch to a MEP directly. That's less possible at the moment. But I wonder whether, our message is therefore generally less heard. I guess so, but I know some industry-funded associations are very, very active when it comes to their advocacy and campaigning efforts, especially what is, I guess, on everybody's big agenda at the moment around the EU Green Deal. And we discussed this EU Green Deal also, whether we should have this now covered this morning. We decided to, by the same speaker, to choose a different topic, because it is almost for our daily discussions that we have as relevant, if not almost more relevant. And Anna from Barcelona will do the introduction to the speaker later. I just wanted to mention the one campaign that we involved this morning was founded by Bobby Kennedy Shriver, a nephew of President Kennedy, son of Eunice Kennedy Shriver, who was also the founder of Special Olympics. And Bobby and one of his good friends, Bono from U2, who is really the face to the One campaign and the initiative HIV in Africa, is maybe one of the most impactful campaigns globally. And for that reason, it was very important to us to get the speakers we have this morning and also the One campaign sharing this morning what they do. I think generally speaking, it is always a good example. It's not an association, but I think we also learn from other larger organizations, nonprofit organizations, NGOs, and that will be the case this morning here as well. So I just wanted to give you some background information about the One campaign, and I would like to then hand it over to Anna. Just a word to the Barcelona Convention Bureau. It's one of the very first, if not the first partner of Association World in general and the initiatives we run. And I cannot be thankful enough to Anna, to the Barcelona team, Esther, Monica, Christoph, for supporting the learning efforts that we provide to the associations, because they really believe in education making the difference. So thank you very much. And with that, I'm handing it over to Anna, and good morning to you to Barcelona.
Thank you, Kai, for your kind words. Good morning, everyone. Good morning from sunny and warm Barcelona. It's great to see you all this morning. Welcome to all of you on behalf of the entire Barcelona Convention Bureau team. I'm very glad to introduce the first session and speaker this morning, someone who is familiar to me because I met David in 2019 when he ran a full-day workshop in person, by the way, together with Association World for about 25 associations about creating impactful global advocacy and campaigning initiatives. David McNair is Executive Director, Global Policy of the One Campaign and was named one of the 99 top foreign policy leaders under 33 in 2002 already. He holds a PhD in social geography from the Queen's University of Belfast. David makes the point, the pandemic doesn't end with a vaccine. It ends when everyone gets one. Then we can build back better. And understanding that it's also relevant to us in the meetings and events industry. Therefore, his intervention this morning is as relevant for us as convention bureaus as it is for associations, as we gain more insight about the reality of our short, middle-term behaviors when it comes to traveling and planning events. Very recently, David spoke on CNBC Africa about the issue, and we are thankful that he shares his knowledge with us this morning. He's joined by Brandon Logue, EU Policy Manager of the One Campaign. Thank you, David and Brandon, for joining us this morning. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Kai. Morning from rainy and cold Brussels, but it's really great to have a chance to speak to you all about this issue, which is front and center of all of our minds. It's in the headlines every day, and in a sense, for all of our issues, our personal, our professional, and our kind of campaigning and the kind of world that we want to see, this is fundamentally important, because the root in this pandemic will come when everyone who needs one gets a vaccine. So part of what we wanted to do this morning, Brandon and and I should say, Brandon is, you had a poll about, knowing the right people in Brussels. He's the most connected person that I know in Brussels, and he also has been doing an awful lot on this vaccine issue. So if you have any technical questions, he'll be on hand to chip in. But basically we wanted to do two things. First, is explain the issues, what's happening at the moment, and what needs to happen for us to have a kind of swift end to this pandemic that costs the minimum amount of lives and the minimum impact on the economy. But secondly, this is advocacy and campaigning session, and the One Campaign, all that we do is about influencing policy and mobilizing citizens' voices to convince leaders to invest in the fight against extreme poverty. So secondly, part of what we want to do is to use this as a live case study for how we think about campaigning, the kinds of techniques and tools that we use. And therefore, even if this particular issue isn't something that you'd want to campaign on, hopefully you can kind of draw some lessons on it, lessons from it. And we'll have an opportunity in the breakout sessions to talk through, both the issue at hand, but also the implications for our other work. And what kind of opportunities do you see on the horizon for your own campaigning? What do you need in terms of skills and partnerships and resources to make that happen? And then I suppose the kind of bigger question on a lot of our minds is, if you look back in history at events of this scale that affect so many people, they're often described as hinge moments, where after the crisis there is a kind of major reform effort. It happened after World War II with the Bretton Woods institutions and the UN. If you even go back to the 14th century, it happened with the plague and the cholera epidemics in London, which led to things like girls getting land inheritance rights for the first time and cleaning up London's sewage system. So this is also an opportunity for us to think through, once the pandemic is over and the reform effort starts happening, how do we, in Joe Biden's words, build back better? And a big part of that agenda is climate change and the Green New Deal. So why don't I just kick off? I'll just open some slides and we'll just kind of share a little bit about the current situation in relation to the pandemic and what we're doing about it. So can everyone see my screen? Yep, cool. So in terms of agenda, we'll talk a little bit for maximum 20 minutes about why vaccine equity matters, not just having vaccines that are effective, but having vaccines that get to everyone who needs them. Then we'll do a kind of quick Q&A, kind of clarifying questions or things that you're not sure about, and then we'll jump into these breakout sessions to kind of address those broader issues before coming back to kind of share what we've learned and what we've discussed. And there are folks that in each of the sessions who will be kind of prepared to kind of lead the discussion, so that can kind of get off to a kind of a very rapid start. But just kicking off on the vaccine issue in particular, the political emphasis is for leaders to get as many vaccines as possible, vaccinate their whole populations. We're seeing that pressure in the news every day. And of course, that is understandable, and the mandate of politicians is to look after their citizens' interests. But if you look at the epidemiological evidence, and particularly work by Dr. Larry Brilliant, who's an American epidemiologist who played a fundamental role in the eradication of smallpox, he makes the case that if the virus is circulating anywhere, then it can mutate and come back in more virulent strains. We've seen that in the UK, in South Africa, and part of the challenge is that if there are large parts of the global population that aren't vaccinated, particularly those who are immunosuppressed because of other illnesses, it creates a host for the virus to grow and to shift and to change. So that poses a risk to everyone. And that it's kind of an obvious thing to say, but the virus doesn't care where you are, what passport you hold, how much money you have, but of course the response is very much conditioned by those things. So vaccinating domestic populations just won't work. Secondly, and I'll talk about this a little bit in the next slide, failing to beat the virus everywhere will cost the world hundreds of millions, if not trillions of euro. And of course, it's the right thing to do. When you're talking about human rights and the right to health, these kinds of technology should be available to everyone. So just a little bit more detail on this. I mean, you see the news stories hopefully on the side of the slide. But there are a number of studies that have looked at, particularly one study from Northeastern University, where epidemiologists modeled different scenarios. One where rich countries monopolize access and supply to the vaccines, and one where the most vulnerable people, either health workers or older people or those who are immunocompromised everywhere, get vaccinated first. And in the scenario where rich countries monopolize access, twice as many people could die from the virus globally. And that's obviously a kind of issue of procurement. It's also an issue of manufacturing, and the news stories about AstraZeneca and Pfizer BioNTech show how important it is to urgently scale up manufacturing to make sure that we've got enough access. On the economic side, there have been multiple studies that have showed the benefits of prioritizing everyone. So the IMF have estimated that a vaccine rollout everywhere could add 9 trillion to the economy by 2025. But in a scenario where vaccines are hoarded by the rich countries, the rich countries could end up paying the most of the economic cost to that. So a study by the RAND Corporation suggests that unequal distribution could cost the world economy 1.2 trillion per year. A new study out last week from the International Chamber of Commerce suggested that could be as much as 9.2 trillion, with advanced economies occurring almost half of this cost. And the reason for that is that, if you think about supply chains, if you think about, the steel industry in a rich country, which depends on supply from a poor country, if that poor country can't supply the steel because of illness, then it's going to affect, that industry. It'll affect manufacturing, it'll affect construction. And so in the interconnected world that we live in, you know, it doesn't make sense to kind of only look after one part of the population. And of course, it makes economic sense. The study from the International Chambers of Commerce suggests that $4.8 could be rich countries could get back for every $1 that they spend supplying vaccines to poor countries. So what is the situation now? Well, a small group of rich countries comprising about 16% of the global population have locked up 60% of the world's supply, according to Duke University. And you can see the disconnect between that statement that the virus doesn't care how much money you have with the supply of vaccines by income group. And if you look at the rollout of vaccines, this is something I took from Our World in Data last week. Right at the bottom in pink is Africa. So the rollout isn't really kicking off there at all. Here's it in map depiction. And here's from The Economist, their estimate of when different regions of the world will likely to have widespread vaccination coverage. So in the United States and Europe, we're talking about late 2021. In parts of Africa and some parts of Asia and Latin America, we're talking about 2023. So if you think about, you know, the implications for travel, the implications for supply chains running until 2023, you know, it's not a scenario which makes a lot of sense in terms of the global economy or in terms of getting back to normal. And the other thing that, you know, we're doing a lot of work on is the economic fallout for poorer countries. If their economies continue to be affected by the virus for this long, you're looking at, you know, increased debt defaults, you're looking at major job losses and all of the kind of impacts that has on stability, on migration, on political trends, all of that. So in a sense, you know, the window of opportunity to kind of get this right over the next 6 months to a year will have wide-ranging implications for the next decade. So what needs to happen? I mean, the first thing is there is a group which has been put together by the EU, the World Health Organization, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Wellcome Trust, and a number of other partners. And it's called the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator. And it contains 3 pillars on vaccines, treatment, and diagnostics. But basically, you know, donors are committing to that. The idea is that if successful, it can produce 2 billion doses by the end of 2021, half of which would go to the poorest countries. What's striking about this is, you know, the return on investment is kind of remarkable. But of the money that it requires, I think it has about 10 billion. It needs another 27 billion to achieve these 2 billion doses. That sounds like a lot of money, but when you kind of think about the trillions that have been pumped into stimulus packages and the amount that the global economy is losing every week, it's actually, you know, really minimal. The second is a short-term waiver on intellectual property rights, which has been proposed at the World Trade Organization by South Africa and India, and it's getting a lot of support from countries around the world. This is something that, you know, was incredibly important in the fight against AIDS because it allowed low-cost generic treatments to be produced and supplied to poorer countries, and you know, both dramatically reduce the costs and increase the supply when it was needed. The third is a rapid transfer of surplus doses. So I mentioned, you know, the rich countries with 16% of the global population having 60% of the supply. If you translate that into per capita, Canada has bought about 5 vaccines for every citizen. It's quite similar in the US. I think it's slightly less in the EU. But for those countries that have surplus doses, finding a way of transferring those to vulnerable people and essential workers in the poorest countries will be important. And then finally, scaling up of manufacturing. And we know that there are plans. I think J&J has plans to scale up manufacturing in South Africa, but that isn't going to be in place until the end of 2021. So that's what needs to happen. And And then I wanted to move into a little bit about what one is doing about that. And this is kind of partly the transition between, the briefing about the issue and then, the kind of campaigning to try and kind of focus attention and secure political commitments to do something about it. But before I do that, I just wanted to give the opportunity to Brandon to just chip in on anything that I might have missed, particularly in the EU context, because he's following that much more closely. Brandon, did you want to chip in? If not, that's totally fine. But
No, we can keep going ahead.
Okay. So what are we doing about it? Well, whenever the pandemic hit, our president and CEO, Gail Smith, who used to run the US aid administration for President Obama, she recognized that this was an existential threat to our mission. So what we did was we launched a campaign called One World that has two objectives. One is vaccine equity, and one is looking at the economic fallout of the pandemic on the poorest countries. So we've been running petitions. We did something called Pass the Mic, which was basically engaging with celebrities to try and encourage them to use their voice, their megaphone, their reach to get expert voices into the public debate. So the most high profile one of those was Julia Roberts and Anthony Fauci. But we had, I think, about 50 of those with different epidemiologists, economic experts, talking with celebrities to kind of reach new audiences. And that was partly, what we kind of describe as kind of turning up the heat on an issue and kind of making sure that there is kind of global awareness around it. In addition to that, we do a lot of media work, publishing of reports, and trying to convene influential voices. So just at the moment, we're working on an opinion editorial from leading former heads of government in Africa and former finance people to kind of make the case for the economic make the economic case for vaccine equity. But we've also been doing kind of stunts, kind of to get pictures in newspapers. And then the thing on the right of your screen is the One Africa COVID tracker. And basically this was something that we put together in April last year, April, May. And it was kind of responding to the fact that because there weren't that many cases of COVID and weren't that many deaths being recorded in Africa, there was a kind of narrative emerging that, it wasn't that bad and therefore Africa didn't need attention. And, there are all kinds of reasons for that. African countries have responded very well. They've got experience with Ebola. Also, the data is much poorer, so we don't really have a true picture. But if you look at the economic implications on debt, on remittance flows, on food prices, it's really, hugely significant. So we put together this tracker, and there's a weekly email you can sign up to if you just go to that URL, one.org/COVID-19 tracker. You can get a kind of weekly update on what's happening around the African continent. But part of that is just kind of raising awareness, and those are kind of three examples for how we do that. But then on the inside, we've been looking much more at making the case to the new Biden administration, to Ursula von der Leyen, and to other G7 governments, that they need to kind of respond to this in a much more kind of pressing way. So the African Union, for example, has put together a task force on vaccines, led by a telecoms entrepreneur, Strive Masiwa. And he's been talking with all the pharma companies. He's raised $7 billion to procure vaccines. And until recently, the pharma companies were basically saying, we can't sell you any because they've been bought up by rich countries. And so part of what we've been doing is to kind of work on the inside to kind of get those messages to the World Bank, to the IMF, to the Biden team and so on, and find ways of just kind of playing this insider diplomatic role to make sure that we're getting the message across. One particular tool that we put together is called the Vaccine Access Test. And this evaluates countries, it evaluates companies, and it evaluates multilateral institutions on the extent to which they're prioritizing vaccine equity. So we evaluate deals that are being done in terms of like how they allocate doses to those most in need, wherever they are. It looks at policies, it looks at the amount of funding that is being committed to this COVID tools accelerator. And we're updating that every month, and that's being used in our advocacy, because often it's quite powerful if you go to a government to say, look, you're falling behind your neighbor, and that often kind of gets people's attention and kind of opens a conversation to the issues. So here's the current ranking. And again, you can, if you just search in Google for vaccine access test, you can see all of the detail behind, why these countries are doing well or not so well, and what they need to change to increase their scores. But that ranking approach is something that's, lots of people use, but it's incredibly effective, because if you can, for example, go to the United States and say, actually, Canada's doing better than you, that kind of gets people's attention. So that's a little bit about what we've been doing, some of the tools and techniques that we've been using and how we apply those to the vaccine issue. Although, we work on anti-corruption, we work on the HIV/AIDS crisis, we work on gender issues, and we apply the same kind of tools and skill sets to all of those different issues. But I wanted to use this case study because it's so live in everyone's minds as a kind of example for how we do this. So before we go into the breakout sessions, I wonder, is it worth us just kind of opening up if anyone has any questions or things that weren't clear or things that you disagree with, and then we can have a bit of an opportunity to kind of talk through that.
Yes, if I may. Thank you, Miguel. David, I'm so glad to see you're attaching data about potential losses and gains from investment. My thought early in the onset of the virus was the next big, I'm a development economist, so economic inequality in the world is of big concern to me. And I had thought that the next big divide in the world is going to be access to the vaccine. But my other thought was that climate change came along, and a big part of tackling climate change is it's going to be very difficult for us to tackle climate change without tackling economic equality at the same time, because of all the information needs, the environmental management techniques, and all the other things that go with it. And now with the virus, we're seeing the same thing. And so, attaching the ideas of losses to everybody, I think is there's a lot of work that's been done around gender and losses as a result of gender discrimination in the world. And so to start, informing both the damage, the losses, and the potential gains from change behavior, I think is one of the strategies that we need to think about and quantify and put out there much more. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharia. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, that's one of the kind of the arguments that we find most effective, particularly with finance ministers and heads of state. But there's also the connectivity between the issues. I mean, you talked about climate change. I was recently in a meeting with Mary Robinson, who's one of the kind of leading champions for climate change. And the first thing that she said was, if you care about climate change, then you better focus on vaccine equity and on the economic fallout of the pandemic. Because if countries are dealing with a health crisis and they're defaulting on their debt, they're not going to focus on the energy transition. So connecting the dots between those things really matters too.
David, I would have a question if nobody else has. You mentioned your efforts with and through the celebrities. I guess it's always slightly easier to reach influencers through celebrities. How do you bring them in? How do you get them involved? What's the process? Is this already an existing network, or how do you get to these celebrities? What's the advice you could give to associations to also use and get to celebrities to advocate for their cause?
Yeah, well, I suppose the first thing to say is that it's a kind of very time-consuming and costly thing to do, and it's a specific tactic that we use. So it's not, it's not just for the sake of it. And I think we're seeing more and more fatigue with celebrities kind of using their voices in a way that seems disconnected from the experiences of everyday people. But where they are useful is, first, if they've got reach to an audience that you don't have reach with. And quite often, we'll think, I showed this photo of Julia Roberts, which is, I use that photo because, everyone knows her. But quite often we'll be targeting, micro influencers who have a YouTube or an Instagram account. They might have, 20,000 followers rather than 5 million, but those followers trust them and are very loyal to them. So if you want to reach, a particular part of the youth demographic, having that kind of intelligence is really important, because then you can figure out who to target. And then in terms of how it actually happens, often it's through relationships. So, we're privileged in that, a celebrity is part of our network, and he kind of is very generous with his contacts. We also have someone in Los Angeles who kind of spends all of her time focusing on this, building networks with agents and so on. And so at that scale of global Hollywood stars, that's what you need to do. But actually on the smaller scale, in a much more targeted way, you can do it much more informally. And another example is, there is I'm sure you've heard of TikTok, the social media platform. There's a TikTok influencer who explains things to young people, economic concepts, personal finance, in kind of fun ways. And when the pandemic hit, we just contacted him, using his social media accounts to say, we know this pandemic has hit. We know how much it's costing. We also know how much it costs to prepare for pandemics. So it's about 10 billion a year to prepare. And of course, the costs have been, in the range of 10 to 20 trillion. So he visualized the difference between the two with bags of rice. And it's both very striking and very amusing, because you've got this kind of tiny little, pile of rice for how to prepare for pandemics. And then you've got this massive, mountain of rice for the cost of what it took. And we had to, it cost about, $200 to pay for all the rice. And he then donated it to a food bank. But, that's one example where it's just, very low cost. He was up for it because it seemed fun, but actually it got to tens of thousands of people through his channels. And I'll if I got time during the breakout sessions, I'll find the link and kind of send it to you all, because it's a good example.
So, but let's say the work with the celebrities isn't something that can actually be done on the side or by someone already existing. There's a real strategy behind it. And whilst it can have a major impact and influence, it is actually fundamental. It's a fundamental part of your overall strategy. And you have people and a department to really focus on that work and the alignment and the recruitment of those celebrities, I guess. So yes, that makes sense. Thank you very much for that. Shall we go into the breakouts? Carolina was in our breakout, and we could, Carolina, if you don't mind, maybe cover a bit what we discussed. And then also I would like to welcome Alice, who I think is in Paris. Welcome to you.
Thank you.
Carolina,
Thank you.
if you
Hi.
want to go ahead. Thank you.
Sure.
Yes.
I mean, it was a bit of a mix of topics as usual. I was the only association representative there, but we talked a little bit about membership and about the future of the way we plan for the recovery, and the importance of this presentation that comes in not only as a way to show how relevance and responsibility for our associations and for our organizations in general when it comes to recovery, but also the way that we have to look at globally, because we won't be able to recover in events or in any other, the travel and tourism, if we don't have the capacity and the maybe the kindness also to look into that globally, and how can we take this responsibility and help other regions and other organizations to thrive too.
Perfect. Thank you, Carolina, for your input. Would love to hear from some other breakout rooms. If anybody would like to volunteer, we'd love to pick on a few people as well. Jeffer, I see that you've unmuted yourself. Would you like to jump in and share a little bit about what you discussed in your group?
Yeah, we had a lovely kind of coffee break. So we had four of us, all association professionals, either inside associations or serving them. So we learned a lot about each other's associations and what we do and how we do it. I think in the background, we had some questions about, like, okay, the one campaign, it's very impressive what they've done and the scale of what they're doing, and having the sponsors, the great kind of namesakes there. For many of us in associations, we don't have that kind of reach necessarily, but getting our members to speak about things, and our memberships on our little breakout were very different. We have readers of Boardroom Magazine, we have legal professionals, we have consultants in healthcare, we have facilitators, but I think behind that it's getting our voices heard. And as David pointed out, you don't necessarily have to be Bono or Beyonce or Julia Roberts, but having an expert talk. And I know for us at the IAF, we had a case where that we had just almost a random person, but a real expert. But his thing was so clever, it went kind of viral when the interview got retweeted by different people. So in the end, it's about the content and the right spokesperson, not necessarily just the superstars.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeffer, for contributing. I'd love to hear from some of the other groups. We have quite a few notes in the Google Doc, so it's actually turning into, I think, quite a useful resource, or capturing some of the other things that were happening in the breakout rooms. I know that some of you had smaller breakout rooms, others you had larger rooms, but hopefully they were all interesting conversations.
While people are thinking about that, one thought that Carolina sparked in my mind is, as we're kind of trying to mobilize different voices to speak for this issue, one of the things that we find most useful is assembling what we call unusual suspects. So if we can have military leaders, religious leaders, business leaders all talking with one voice, it's incredibly powerful. And actually, one of the things that we've been doing in the US is engaging with the CEOs of airlines and the hospitality industry to say, actually, it's in their interest to get this right. So if any of you are in that world and want to talk about collaborating on an opinion piece or an open letter, that might be something quite specific that we could do together.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting part, connecting the dots here, because we hear a lot of things that we in the developed or Western world don't hear, but everything that happens out there globally has an impact on our industries, whether as association or suppliers. And for that reason, I think, even this is a very different topic. It still actually very much relates to what we do and how we behave in the next months and years to come.
I totally agree, Kai. And as boardroom, we're following that direction too. So we're opening up the line of subjects, talking about the impact of the global changes in the world, which will have an impact on association. But I think the subject you have chosen today really is very important and very well done as well. Thank you.
I'm looking for some other volunteers to share what they discussed in their group, and particularly we're looking for people who discussed something different or have something incremental to add. I think that's always good to share so that we have more information between us. Sven, I can see you raised your hand, so I'll spotlight you.
Thanks. No, just briefly, what we discussed is basically the impact the entire situation has on the event space. I think from our point of view, the advocacy is mainly around accelerating as much as possible the vaccinations. But then we came also to the question, okay, build back better, what is going to be the lasting impact on organized events? I think there it's a mix of a very new way of operating events with more focus on safety and healthy, changing completely things like catering, for example. I think the other impact is also the entire digital element. I think it was touched upon already a couple of times. We all have done digital in one way or another, but there's still so much to learn to actually do it properly. I think there, as an association, we have a big role to play.
Perfect. Thank you, Sven. Thank you for your contribution. I think I saw somebody else with their hands raised. Sharda, was that you? Looking for hands raised.
Yes, Sabine has written up our discussion and it's here in the chat. And very quickly, what we talked about was firstly the opportunity to expand manufacturing into developing countries. There are a number of developing countries that do actually have vaccine manufacturing capacity. I know, for example, South Africa does and India does, but I'm sure that must be the case other Asian countries, Latin America, possibly other African countries. And if there's a waiver on the intellectual property and this expansion, it could create jobs in developing countries as well, which could be quite a good opportunity. And also then other industries could open up, such as travel, export, and other things alongside the transportation of the vaccine. And then what do we need to do that? Well, we need to get the conversation going. We need the role of the WHO to become much more prominent in this. And we also need different international agencies to come together and stand as one, because that will put out a very important signal to the world. If you have, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and the WHO all standing alongside each other in this campaign, that's the one thing. And then after we've got to 2023, please God, we've really, accelerated vaccination and reached herd immunity. By that time, we can then use the gains from this campaign to start accelerating other campaigns that are linked in, such as climate, such as gender, such as racial equity. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. I saw Brandon raise his hand, so I'll bring you onto the screen, Brandon. I know you're one of the experts here, so I wonder if you would respond to that or maybe add anything that you have to add there.
Yeah, thanks so much. I just want to come in really quickly on the TRIPS waiver and echo a little bit what David said about how important and influential it can be for sort of everyone to be speaking with one voice on this sort of issue, because the TRIPS waiver is probably one of the hardest and most ambitious asks I think that we're going to have in this pandemic. There's already over 100 countries that actually support this waiver, but it's been blocked at the WTO since October because essentially the US, the EU, Canada, and the UK are refusing to let it go through. And it's sort of the same thing we saw with the Doha Declaration back in 2001 with the AIDS crisis. It took a massive global effort for that to go through. And I think we're really going to need the same sort of political momentum to get this one through this time around. But I can't understate how important it is, because I think this is really one of the only long-term solutions we're going to have to sort of getting manufacturing capacity up to scale. Like was mentioned, South Africa, India, lots of developing countries actually have the capacity to increase production, not only of vaccines, but also really useful treatments like monoclonal antibodies and other things that are under very strict patent protections. So I think this is one area where we've seen a lot of collaboration already from the development community. We have almost the entire African Union body on board with this. But when we present these sorts of arguments to the European Commission and other leaders, usually they are concerned with the impact on private sector and sort of where they're going to get pushback from private companies. So I think this is one area where if we have more collaboration with associations, with people representing the private sector, I think it might open up a door that we could potentially move the needle a little bit on these issues. So I think if this is something that anyone is interested in collaborating with us on, we're going to be doing a lot of advocacy this month before the potential vote next month. So it would be great to get in touch and see if others are interested to work with us on this.
Perfect. Thank you so much for bringing that, Brandon. Didier, you have your hand raised. Shall I? Are you ready? Perfect.
Yes. Yeah. Hello. I just have maybe a comment about. I totally agree with what Charla said before. That it would be great to have large organizations like WTO, WHO, or this type of organization having one voice. On the other side, I think in general the public have lost quite a lot of trust in these organizations because they're too loud, too slow to react. They are too much politics in there, and I think they have lacking a lot of confidence from the general public. And on the other side, I see all these Twitter, Facebook, social media ongoing, and where is the voice of the normal people? And I think the future, I think, has to be also very much focused on the voice of everybody. And I think the one campaign is touching, I mean, the general public, and I think the strength of the general public is going to be more and more important, because you see on the climate change in Europe, you see this little girl moving people, not doing much at the end, but moving a lot of people and changing opinion, changing people's mindset. So I think this is something that we have to probably keep into consideration. I don't know what you think about that, Brandon or David.
Perfect. Thank you, Didier, for your contribution. Brandon, David, any thoughts about that particular topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Didier, the example of Greta Thunberg is a really powerful one, because in one respect, you know, yes, it was just a lot of noise. In another respect, I think that had a significant impact on the European Parliament elections, which in turn gave the EU a mandate for the Green New Deal. So I think, like, we need to be thinking long term about these things and mobilizing citizens' voices while also engaging with the direct policy decisions right in front of us. So thinking on those two twin tracks is really important.
Go ahead.
One important thing, and Brandon, I'm thankful you brought it up, is the point of cross collaboration. I think that is so important when we try to have impact. I mean, we as associations, we are trying to lobby for our cause or for a matter, for a theme, but sometimes I feel we work in isolation. You know, and I think it's very important that we start thinking about how we better cross collaborate. It's something that we have to not only think about, we also need to create a vision on how to do that better, whether it's with amongst the international association community, across regions in Europe. So I think that is something that is a bit of homework for all of us, but thank you for bringing it up, because I do think not always, and this comes a bit to strategic alliances. I think we have a workshop on that, an online session in April or so. But it's those strategic alliances, not only amongst associations, but also go beyond our borders. And whether it's with an organization like the One Campaign or others, I think this is something that we need to look at, because it does help. Those alliances or partnerships help us to achieve our mission better as an association. And it is clear, we as association, we should be mission driven, and like you are, and therefore there is a lot of alignment there. Just one quick question there on that note, Brandon, David. It's important to present hardcore data to influencers and legislators, etc. But how much is this also about storytelling and emotion?
Maybe I can just come in really quickly. I think that it's a little bit of both, but what I've seen is that usually the hardcore data isn't enough. We can go to policymakers with all the stats, all the data, and we're doing that right now on some really difficult issues. And it just simply isn't enough. You can be saying all the right things, but then as soon as you bring a more personal element to it, and I think when you start to bring people to the table. And our youth activists are actually really good at doing this. Just bringing, normal people who aren't professionals, but who are saying essentially the same thing, but with a personal element that conveys the same message from a personal perspective. It's incredible how much more effective and receptive some policymakers can be, when they're hearing these messages coming from normal people, as opposed to the sort of technocrats and experts. So I think you need to have a little bit of both, but it's really, I'm always amazed when I see how some policymakers respond to, the voices of our youth activists or just normal supporters. And so that's why I think it's really important to sort of thread that needle and make sure that your message is relatable from, a sort of emotional sort of perspective. So I would say it has to be both, but sometimes the data isn't enough.
I heard recently a quote that said, "Nobody wants a lecture, everybody wants a story." And I think that's definitely true. But it also, depending on the type of audience, it matters what kind of data you're bringing. So hardcore economic data matters for finance ministries. Polling data matters for politicians, particularly in the lead up to elections. And so just kind of tailoring it in the right way, and finding out, not just what the message is, but who the messenger is really matters. Everyone expects the one campaign to say we need more money for vaccines. If we brought a kind of very, very credible former CEO of a pharma company, that would have a completely different reaction than me saying it,
Yes, and you're actually saying one crucial element, and I think we have to do a new online session on that, is how do you actually raise your money to do this work? I think it's not a minor element of it. Funding is always important. So I think that'll be a quite interesting best practice to share as well. I think we have time for one more question from the attendees, if there are any.
Yeah, I had a question for David about the tool that you had. It was the kind of survey where you got the ranking at the end. This is something we always struggle to do. We want to do outreach. We want to get out to people to get their perspective, so we have more data on our particular association's field, which is facilitating with impact. How did you go about deciding on which criteria you want to highlight? Because of course, statistics can be, it's a choice, it's misleading sometimes. So any lessons learned from that whole activity of doing that kind of outreach activity? And if you were to do it again, would you do anything differently?
Yeah, thanks, Jeffrey. It's a really good question. I think that those kinds of rankings, like what you're doing is basically kind of making judgment calls on what's important, and then radically simplifying complex information. So people are always going to be annoyed. Someone's going to be annoyed. What we did was, we put together what we felt were the kind of most important categories, evaluated that against what we could, reasonably collect in terms of data. And then we got, input from, think tank experts, people in the pharma industry and so on. But we were also really nervous. We had our lawyers kind of look at it to evaluate libel risk, all that kind of thing. And the other thing that we did was to commit to reviewing it on a regular basis. So if there were things that kind of came up, or kind of issues with the methodology, that we'd do that on a monthly basis. So
I imagine you want to kind of get it right the first time, though, so you can track the data analysis, so you can see the trend. If you change the questions every 10 minutes, then it's not that insightful.
Yeah, exactly. So we did a lot of work to try and get it right, and partly, it was kind of making sure that we had that expert input, partly, so that we had a good quality product, and partly it was just kind of cover our own backs in terms of, if we got criticism, that we could say, well, we spoke to these people and they, so that, that included like this London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and lots of kind of credible groups.
So you had, and they were very credible groups to kind of validate it, but it went out under your name, not under Deloitte or PricewaterhouseCoopers or something.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
And in terms of the team, we had basically two people, like a research assistant and then
coming in the days and so on. We have to finish the session. Some people are already coming in for the next session. I mean, first of all, David and Brandon, congratulations to all your great work. I mean, that is really powerful and impactful, providing us this morning that perspective of being able to look at this on a much broader scale. I think has been tremendously helpful because it has an impact and influence on what we all do. So thank you so much for being with us this morning. We will keep that cross collaboration in mind, and we'll connect you with one or the other association. We are in this open platform now, and we'll keep sharing information with each other, and you will all receive David's and Brandon's information so you can engage with them if you wish to do so. Again, David, Brandon, thank you so much for your time, for your sourceful information, and good luck with your ongoing advocacy and campaigning efforts, and hopefully we'll be able to welcome you in the near future, and let us know how this all works, and of course not to forget about how you raise your money to do this great thing. So thank you very much to both of you.